The morning the thresh came back. I was standing at my kitchen window, with a cup of tea going cold in my hand, watching the light come up over the Caliph Shore district, the way it does in early autumn, when the sky is clear, and the atmospheric processors have cycled down overnight, and the air has a particular stillness. The kind that makes the city feel like it is holding its breath before the day begins. I am 71 years old. I retired from teaching 2 years ago after 38 years in the Accord public school system history and civic studies, middle grades. The same school building for 26 years, before the district consolidated, and I moved to the new campus on the Caliph Shelf. I live in the upper floors of a residential tower at the north end of the district, 12 floors up, with a view east over the water and north up the coast. And I have sat at that kitchen window most mornings for 19 years with tea and watched the shore come alive and not thought very much about anything in particular. It is the best part of the day. It has the quality of things that are reliably good, not exciting, not remarkable, just consistently right, in the way that a morning window and a hot drink and a quiet hour are always right before the day gets complicated. I had been a school teacher for 38 years. I had taught the history of what happened to Earth and what Earth built afterward to several thousand students. I had taught it in the standard curriculum format required by the Accord's educational framework, which means I had taught the time skip, the return event templates, the construction of the Accord and the defense infrastructure, and the contingency preparation programs, including the thresh contingency, specifically, which was covered in detail in the 8th grade civic studies unit, because the Caliph Shore district was one of the districts where the thresh history had direct local connection, where the signal beacon had been embedded in the electromagnetic substrate of the coastal shelf, and where the first xenological teams had done their analysis 12,000 years ago. My students knew the thresh the way students in coastal districts know the tides as something built into the landscape of where they lived, something that required respect and understanding, and that had been studied and prepared for so long and so thoroughly that the preparation itself had become part of the identity of the place. I tell you that so you understand why I recognized what I was seeing from the first moment, before I had even put the cup down. They came in from the northeast, out of the early morning sky, descending on a vector so gradual it seemed at first like a change in the quality of the atmosphere, a shift in the color of the high sky, a deepening that was not cloud cover, because the sky was clear to the horizon in every direction. I noticed it the way you notice changes in peripheral vision, the way something at the edge of awareness arrives before the center of attention has fully caught up. I stood at the window and watched the shift deepen and resolve gradually, over the course of perhaps 3 minutes, from an atmospheric quality into an unmistakable visual fact. Vessels, thousands of them. I know the word thousands sounds like the imprecision of fear or of awe, like a number chosen because the real count was too large to track. I do not mean it imprecisely. The Accord's published record of the engagement, released in full inside 72 hours as the transparency protocols require, documents 4,311 thresh vessels in the primary formation, with a secondary dispersal of approximately 900 vessels in the outer approach shell. I watched most of them descend. I stood at my kitchen window with my tea going cold in my hand, and I watched 4,000 vessels come through the early autumn sky over the Caliph Shore district, and I watched them hold their approach, if you could call it a formation, which I am not sure you can with a precision that was not the precision of military discipline or tactical coordination, but the precision of something that does not need to think about how it moves, the precision of water filling a space, the precision of iron filing aligning to a field. That is the word that came to me first, watching them come. Not fleet, not formation, not armada, tide. They were moving like a tide, like something that does not have a strategy for moving, because strategy is what you apply when you have a choice about whether to move and in which direction. And the thresh were moving because they did not have a choice. They were moving because 44,000 years ago, before the current configuration of the Caliph Shore district, before the configuration, before that, before the configuration, before that, before any of it, something had come to Earth and seeded a signal. Not a garrison, not an occupation, not a colony in any sense the word normally carries. A signal. A frequency embedded in the electromagnetic substrate of the coastal shelf, built to broadcast on a 44,000-year cycling period, built to call home a hive mind that would not think about coming back but would simply come, when the cycle completed, the way water fills a depression in the ground. Because the water does not think about filling the depression, it just fills it. I want to try to describe what the vessels looked like, because I think it matters, and because the description in the educational records had never quite prepared me for the reality of them. The Xenological Archive's visual documentation is accurate as far as it goes. The records show the vessel forms clearly enough, but documentation cannot convey scale at lived distance. And scale was what I was experiencing from the window. They were not built in the way that anything human is built, or anything I had seen in the records of the other civilizations whose vessels had returned to Earth over the centuries. Human warships are built on a logic of function, and mass angles and armor, and the visible architecture of purpose. The other returning forces our district's history covered were built on various logics: military authority, religious ceremony, administrative formalism. The Thresh vessels had no logic of form that I could identify from the window. They were organic in shape, the way living things are organic, not styled to resemble biology but actually biology, grown rather than constructed. The hull surfaces irregular and textured, in the way of a shell, or a reef, rather than in the way of manufactured metal. They were dark at their centers and lighter at their edges, where the early morning light caught the curve of the hull surface and scattered. They were large, very large, but their size was hard to read because nothing about their form gave the eye a reference point. No visible seams, no port clusters, no weapons arrays, just the shape. The massive, quiet, biological shape of something that had not been designed but had been grown for a purpose as old as the civilization that grew it. They did not look dangerous the way that a warship looks dangerous. They looked like part of a process, like components of a system operating exactly as it was built to operate, unconcerned with anything that was not the system, which was exactly what they were. I had taught the Thresh history for 38 years. I knew what was descending through my morning sky. I knew it with the knowledge that comes from decades of professional engagement with a subject, the knowledge that lives in the chest and the hands, as well as the head, that does not require conscious retrieval, that is simply there. I knew what a Thresh formation looked like from the visual records in the educational archive. I knew the 4,000-year life cycle of their homing signal deployment. I knew the xenological records description of their biological intelligence structure. A distributed hive mind with no individual consciousness in any human sense, only the collective logic of the whole, which is not logic in the way we use the word but instinct, operating at civilizational scale. I knew what they had come for, and I knew that they had come exactly when the models predicted they would come, because the Xenological Division had calculated the cycling period with a precision that was now confirmed to within 41 days, across a 44,000-year span, and I knew what was going to happen. I knew what was going to happen, and I stood at the window and watched anyway, because knowing what is going to happen and standing in the actual presence of it happening are two completely different experiences, and I had taught the history of one my entire career, and never expected to be in the presence of the other. I should tell you something about how I taught the Thresh unit, because it is relevant to what I am trying to say, and because it has stayed with me. The 8th grade Civic Studies curriculum in the Calith Shore District allocates 3 weeks to the Thresh contingency, more than most other districts. Because of the local connection, the signal beacon was embedded in the substrate of our shelf, specifically, not in some abstract elsewhere, and the first xenological teams who decoded it had their offices 2 kilometers from the school, where I spent 26 years of my career. That geographic specificity makes the history real to students, in a way that general curriculum cannot. I spent 38 years teaching students who could walk to the memorial marker on the Caliph shelf, after class, and read the date. The signal was decoded, and understand that people in their district, people who had lived in apartments not unlike their own, who had walked the same streets, to the same shore, had been the ones who first understood what was coming and decided to prepare for it. The hardest part of the unit was not the history itself. The hardest part was the question that students asked every year without fail, in roughly the same form. If the Thresh are just following an instinct, if they are not choosing to come back, if they do not even know that Earth has changed, are they responsible for what happens when they get here? Is it wrong that the answer is what it is? I had different versions of my answer to that question over 38 years, and I do not think any of them was fully satisfying, which is probably appropriate. What I always came back to was this: the question of the Thresh's moral responsibility, whether you decide it is full or partial or absent, does not change what Earth is required to do in response to their arrival. The Thresh did not choose to be built the way they were built. They did not choose the cycling period of their homing signal. They cannot choose not to follow the pulse when it fires. All of that may be true. It is also true that 4,000 vessels descending toward an inhabited planet with a harvest intent will cause catastrophic harm to that planet, whether or not the vessels chose to do so, and the planet is not obligated to accept catastrophic harm, because the agent of harm is acting without free will. 12,000 years of preparation to prevent that harm is not an act of aggression. It is an act of stewardship, of the planet, of its people, of everything built here across 44,000 years of continuous effort. The students mostly understood that. Some of them still found the grief in it, which I thought was healthy. I was finding the grief in it too, standing at the window. The city was doing its morning around me, below and beyond the window. The transit lanes were running their first cycles of the day. The early shift workers were moving through the streets, at the district's lower levels. The market on the corner of the Caliph shelf, the one that opens before dawn and sells from the shore's morning catch, was running its full prep. The ordinary sounds of a district that has been lived in continuously for longer than most civilizations have histories, doing what it does every morning, unchanged. Above all of it, in a sky that had been clear and unremarkable 30 minutes earlier, 4,000 vessels descending in a silence so complete and a density so total that the sky between them had disappeared. The silence was the thing I was not prepared for. I want to try to say this carefully, because I think it is important for understanding what the Thresh were and what their return meant. And I think it is something that the published record, which is correctly factual and correctly clinical, in the way that important records should be, cannot fully convey. The silence of the Thresh formation was not the silence of a fleet maintaining communications discipline. It was not the silence of a force that had decided, for tactical reasons, to approach without hailing. It was not a choice. The Thresh were not making choices. They were following a pulse that had been calling them for 44,000 years, and the idea that there was anything between them and the source of that pulse that constituted a factor to be evaluated and communicated about was not part of their biological logic. It was not part of their biological logic because their biological logic did not include the category of obstacle as distinct from the category of noise. The pulse was here. They were following the pulse. The harvest would proceed. That was the totality of the Thresh understanding of that morning. I had read descriptions of the Thresh's cognitive structure in the xenological records many times. I had taught those descriptions in the 8th grade unit and tried to convey what it meant to be a kind of intelligence that is not individual, not strategic, not capable of what humans would recognize as deliberation. I had explained it with the cattle metaphor that appears in the standard curriculum, the herd following the glow, moving not because each individual cow has decided to move, but because the herd instinct is moving, and they are the herd. And my students had understood it as a concept. I had understood it as a concept. Standing at the window that morning, watching the silence, I understood it as a fact. 4,000 311 vessels that were not hailing us, not acknowledging us, not registering us as a factor in any way that produced a response moving through our morning sky toward the homing signal, the way a river moves through a landscape. Not because the landscape means nothing to the river. The river simply moves downhill. The river doesn't have an opinion about the landscape. I put my cup down. I pressed my hand flat to the window glass, the way my grandmother used to press her palm to the old concrete building cores and say she could feel the grain of something older underneath. The glass was cold. I could feel the vibration of the transit lanes far below, the ordinary hum of the city going about its business under a sky that had been transformed into something I did not have clean words for. My granddaughter had called me the evening before the arrival. She was 14 and studying at a school on the northern shelf of the district, and she had the quality of a 14-year-old who has just learned something enormous and needs to process it by talking to the adult they trust the most. She had been briefed at school. The district's standard notification protocol sends parents and guardians a briefing 3 weeks before any Accord contingency event, and the schools send an equivalent briefing to students at an age-appropriate level, and she wanted to know if I was scared. I told her that was the wrong question. She asked me what the right question was. I said the right question was, did the people who spent 12,000 years building the answer to this do their jobs? She thought about that for a moment. Then she asked, did they? I said yes. She said, how do you know? I said because 12,000 years of careful people decided it would work, and because the generations who came after them kept the work alive and current and ready, and because that is what 12,000 years of institutional memory looks like when it is working correctly. I said the answer had been certified and ready for 1,100 years before this morning. She said 1,100 years is a long time to wait. I said yes. I said that is the point. She seemed to find that satisfying in a way I had not fully anticipated. I thought about that conversation the next morning, standing at the window. Now I want to be precise about the thresh contingency and what it was, because I think the precision matters for understanding what happened that morning and what the 1,100 years of waiting actually produced. The Accord Thresh Contingency Authority was established 12,000 years ago, in the first years after the xenological team's decoding of the homing signal. It was a small division to begin with, a group of analysts and engineers tasked with two parallel objectives: understand the thresh in sufficient depth to model their behavior accurately, and build a countermeasure capable of interrupting their arrival or redirecting it. The people who established it knew they would not see it used. They built it anyway. Their successors inherited the work, added to it, refined the models, extended the engineering research, and handed it forward. This process continued, generation after generation, for 12,000 years. The same institutional chain of professional succession, the same mandate, the same patient accumulation of understanding toward a single prepared answer. I taught the history of the Thresh Contingency Authority every year in the 8th grade unit, and I want to be honest with you about something. It is a difficult thing to teach well. The difficulty is not in the facts. The facts are well documented, and the curriculum materials are excellent. The difficulty is in making students feel the texture of the work, as opposed to simply knowing its duration and outcome. 12,000 years is a number. It is easy to say. It is almost impossible to fully absorb. I tried many approaches over 38 years, and I am not sure I ever found the definitive one. What I found worked best was to focus not on the span, but on the individual decision, on the specific, unglamorous, practical choice that each generation of the Thresh Contingency Authority made: to continue, to maintain the archive, to refresh the models, to update the engineering documentation, to train the next cohort of specialists, to write the annual operational review in the knowledge that the operational review would almost certainly never be relevant in the writer's own lifetime, and to write it carefully anyway, because careful records are the only kind that are useful, and because the point was not whether you would see the outcome, but whether the outcome would be possible. I told my students, The person who wrote the very first operational review for the Thresh Contingency Authority, 12,000 years ago, could not have known their name would mean nothing to anyone reading this account. They wrote it for the people who would come after them, in the specific understanding that the people who came after them were the point of the work. That is not a small thing. Most people, most of the time, do their work because of some connection to its outcome. They will use what they build, or they will see it used, or at least the generation they can personally imagine will see it used. The Thresh Contingency Authority required something different: the ability to do excellent work, in full knowledge, that neither you, nor anyone you personally loved, would ever see the work matter. Only the work mattered, not your witness of it. I have found, in my 2 years of retirement, that I think about this more than I expected to. I taught it for 38 years, as something admirable in others. Standing at the window that morning, watching the sky above the Caliph Shore District fill with 4,000 vessels, following a pulse no preparation could redirect, I felt it in a different way. The way you feel something when you are no longer the teacher of it, but the recipient of it. The countermeasure that emerged from 6,000 years of engineering research, the Thresh Signal Override and Redirection Architecture, which the Accord's technical community called TSORA, and which my students knew as the answer, because that is what it was operated on, a principle that I am not technically qualified to explain in complete technical detail, but that I understand at the functional level. The Thresh homing signal, the pulse that had been broadcasting from Earth's electromagnetic substrate for 44,000 years, and that was the entire basis of their return, could not simply be turned off. The pulse was embedded in the substrate. It was not a device that could be disabled. It was a frequency encoded into the planet's own electromagnetic field at specific harmonic resonances. You could not turn it off any more than you could turn off the planet's magnetic field. But you could answer it. TSORA broadcast a countersignal on the same harmonic frequencies, a signal that the Thresh's biological logic would interpret as the completion of their cycle, as the confirmation of arrival, as the closure of the loop that had been open for 44,000 years. The countersignal did not say, "Stay away." It said, "Yes, you are here. The cycle is complete. The harvest is in this direction," and pointed outward, away from Earth, toward a vector that would take the Thresh out of the Accord system and into open space, where their biological logic would eventually lose the signal, and the instinct would complete its cycle, and they would stop. For a hive mind that follows a pulse by instinct, the answer to the pulse is the same as the pulse. You cannot argue with instinct. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot appeal to its reason, or its self-interest, or its fear. What you can do, if you have 6,000 years to learn how, is speak its language well enough to redirect it. TSORA began broadcasting at 0647 local time. The Thresh formation had crossed the outer approach boundary 37 minutes earlier, descending in silence through the early autumn sky over the Caliph Shore District. I did not know, standing at the window, exactly when 0647 was. I had no countdown. I was watching the sky and the city below simultaneously. The way you watch two things when both of them feel important and neither of them will wait. The city was still going about its business, which was what the Accord had told it to do, and what it was doing because this was Caliph Shore. And Caliph Shore had been told since the 2nd grade that this was going to happen and that the preparation was in place. The transit lanes on their morning cycles. The market on the corner. The sound of the district waking. Above it all, the sky full of vessels that were not thinking about any of it. And then, I watched approximately 900 of those vessels change course. I could see it from the window. The outer formation, the secondary dispersal that had been holding at higher altitude, began, over the course of perhaps 8 minutes, to adjust their vectors. Not dramatically, not with the sharp, angular turns of tactical maneuvering, but smoothly, the way a current adjusts when a new force acts on it. Smoothly and continuously, each vessel following the shift of the others, the 900 vessels, rerouting together the way a flock of birds turns, not because each individual bird has decided to turn, but because the instinct of the whole has found a new direction, and the individuals are the whole. I watched them shift and adjust, and then I watched them move. Away, outward. The TSORA redirect, working on the 900 vessels in the outer approach shell, whose biological pull cycle was early enough that the counter signal could override it. The 900, not the 4,000. The xenological division had modeled this. The published record confirms the model was accurate within a margin of less than 4%. Approximately 40% of the primary formation, the vessels already deep in the final phase of the approach. Their biological logic passed the threshold at which the TSORA redirect could override the homing instinct, would not turn. Could not turn. The pull was too advanced. The cycle was too far along. The counter signal could answer the instinct in its early phase. In its final phase, the instinct answered nothing. It only moved. 4,311 vessels continued their descent. I want to say something here about what I felt in those minutes, because I think the feelings are part of the record in a way that the published operational documentation cannot include, and because I think the feelings are honest, and honest things deserve to be said. I felt grief, not fear. I had moved past fear sometime in the previous hour, somewhere in the process of watching the tide come down, and pressing my hand to the cold window glass. Fear is for things you do not expect, or for things that might be stopped by something you do. I was not going to do anything to stop or change what was happening, and I had expected it, and the preparation was in place, and the answer had been ready for 1,100 years. What I felt, watching the 4,000 vessels continue their descent after the 900 turned away, was grief. Grief at what they were. Grief at the particular quality of an intelligence that is so complete in its nature, so absolutely committed to the instinct that organized it, that it cannot register that the world has changed around that instinct. They were following the pulse. The pulse was here. They had followed it for 44,000 years, and across interstellar distances, and through whatever they had experienced in that time, and they had arrived, and the harvest was going to proceed. And the fact that the world had built an answer to that arrival in the intervening years was not information they could process, not because they were stupid, not because they were malign, because the category of the world having changed was not a category their nature contained. 44,000 years ago, they had come to a planet with a sparse pre-technological population and had embedded a signal and had left, and in their biological logic, the planet was the same planet in the same state, and the harvest was going to proceed as it had on 1,000 other worlds across their long history. The fact that the planet had spent 44,000 years becoming something that bore no resemblance to what they had left was not failure on their part. It was not arrogance. It was simply the limit of what a hive instinct can model when the gap between the seeding and the harvest is 44,000 years. I watched them come down, and I thought about the analogy I had used in the classroom for 38 years, cattle moving toward a light, following the only map they had ever been given, certain the light would be what it had always been, and I felt the grief of understanding the analogy completely at last. Standing at the window, watching something that had followed a light for 44,000 years arrive, to find that the light had become something else entirely, not by betrayal, not by deception, simply by the passage of time and the choices of the people who had lived through it. The cattle do not choose to move toward the light. The glow calls them, and they go. They do not know what the light is. They do not know what waits at the end of the path. They only know the pull, and the direction, and the going. And if you have been watching them come from far enough away, if you have built the answer for long enough, there is a moment when you understand, with complete clarity, that the grief is not for yourself, and not for what they might have done, if they had arrived unmet. The grief is for the distance they traveled, following something that could not tell them the truth about where they were going. 44,000 years of crossing the dark on the certainty of an instinct that was accurate everywhere it had ever been used, and wrong this once, here, because this world had spent its intervening time differently than every other world in their harvest history. I thought. They crossed all of that space. They came all of that way. Not knowing. Not able to know. Just following. I stood at the window with my hand on the glass, and I held that thought for a moment, and then I let it go, because there was nothing to do with it. Grief is honest, but it is not useful, and the work of 12,000 years was about to do what 12,000 years of work was built to do, and no feeling I had about the thresh would change that, or should change that. The orbital defense ring engaged at 0714 local time. I have been careful to say that I do not want to describe this in a way that makes it something it was not. It was not a battle. A battle is something that two parties conduct by making decisions about how to proceed against each other. The thresh were not making decisions. They were executing an instinct. The Accord's defense systems were executing a protocol that had been prepared and rehearsed and refined across 12,000 years. Against a force whose behavior had been modeled with the accuracy that 12,000 years of dedicated xenological study produces. The operational sequence in the fire control architecture had been certified and loaded 1,100 years before it was needed. It was not improvised. It was not reactive. It was the delivery of an answer that had been ready since before anyone watching that morning had been born. I want to be honest about something else, too. I had expected to feel I am not sure, something larger than what I felt, something commensurate with the scale of the event. 38 years of teaching the thresh contingency had built in me a kind of expectation of what this moment would feel like, an expectation shaped by the way history always looks larger and more dramatic than the days it was made of. The decisive moment, the culmination, the prepared answer, delivering its conclusion. What I felt when the orbital ring engaged was something much quieter than that. It was not triumph. Triumph is what you feel when you have done something, and I had not done this. It was not relief exactly, or not only relief. It was something closer to the feeling of recognizing the end of a very long sentence, the particular quality of a thing arriving exactly where it was going, in exactly the way it was built to arrive, after a very long time of being built toward. Not exciting, not dramatic, simply right, correct. The rightness of 12,000 years of work that was done correctly, and that worked. I thought about the certification teams who had loaded the operational sequence into the fire control architecture 1,100 years ago. I thought about what it must have felt like to write the final certification report on something that would not be used in your lifetime, to sign off on a system that would run its maintenance cycles for 1,100 years before anyone found out whether you had done the work correctly. To go home that evening and eat dinner and not know. To live out your career and your retirement and eventually your death, not knowing. To hand the knowing to people who had not yet been born. I thought, they never got to feel this, the rightness of the correct thing working. They built it and certified it and handed it forward and never got to stand at a window and feel it work. That felt like the grief's true location. Not the thresh, in the end. The people who built the answer and were gone. From my window, 11 floors above the Caliph Shore street level, it looked like light. I do not say that to minimize it. I say it because that is what it looked like, and because I think the truth of what it looked like is important. The engagement was conducted at altitude, at the orbital ring's operational distance, well above the atmospheric layer, where surface visible effects are dramatic. What I saw was the particular clean white of the ring's energy discharge, repeated across the arc of the ring's field of view from my apartment window, very bright in the way that things are bright. When the energy involved is on a scale, your eyes are not calibrated to read correctly. The brightness lasted 11 minutes and 23 seconds. The published record is exact on this point. During those 11 minutes, there was a low harmonic that reached the surface. Not a sound exactly below the threshold of normal hearing, felt in the chest, rather than heard through the ears. I have felt seismic harmonics before, during the coastal shelf maintenance cycles, and it felt like that. An authority in the low register. A vibration that your body registers before your mind does. It lasted perhaps 4 of the 11 minutes. And then it stopped. And then the light stopped. And then the sky over the Caliph Shore district was clear again. Clear and empty. In the way that a sky is clear and empty after something has been removed from it, rather than after something was never there. The transit lanes had not paused. The market on the corner had not closed. A delivery vehicle was making its morning run on the street below my building. The ordinary sound of its route rising up to my window, unchanged. The atmospheric processors were cycling at their normal early morning rate. Below me, the district was going about its business in the autumn morning light. And above me, the sky was the sky again. And 11 minutes and 23 seconds had delivered the conclusion of 12,000 years of preparation. I stood at the window for a long time after. I do not know exactly how long. I did not look at the time. I stood with my hands still pressed flat against the glass, and I looked at the empty sky, and I thought about the people who had built the answer that was not there anymore, and had never once looked out a window at the moment it worked. The xenological team that first decoded the signal 12,000 years ago. The engineers who began the 6,000-year project of building a counter-signal architecture in full knowledge that their great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren would be the ones to finish it. The generations in between who maintained the work and advanced it and handed it forward. Each one adding their layer. Each one making the choice not once, but continuously, throughout a career, throughout a life to do excellent work in service of an event they would not see. The division heads who approved budget cycles for a project with no deliverable in any human lifetime. The certification teams who loaded the operational sequence into the fire control architecture 1100 years ago and wrote their reports and went home. All of them gone. None of them at a window that morning. My granddaughter called at 8:30. She had been watching the public monitoring feed at school, the standard Accord citizen notification channel that runs during any contingency event, and she wanted to know if I was all right. I told her I was fine. She asked if it was what I expected. I thought about that for a moment. I told her it was exactly what I expected, and also nothing like I expected, and that both of those things were true at once. She said that didn't make sense. I said, give it 30 years. Give it 30 years. And the difference between knowing what is going to happen and being in the presence of it will make complete sense to you, I said. And the reason it makes sense will not be a lesson you can teach from a classroom. She said that didn't make sense either. I said, I know. I said, come to your school for lunch, and I'll try to explain it in person. And she said yes, and I said good, and we rang off. I dressed and went downstairs, and walked through the Caliph Shore district on a clear autumn morning, past the market on the corner that was running its full midday operation, past the memorial marker at the base of the Caliph shelf that notes the original location of the homing beacon and the year it was first decoded, past the transit lane that was running on schedule, past the school where 38 years of students had learned the history of what had been done here and why it mattered. The marker at the base of the Caliph shelf is modest. It is a flat stone, set into the pavement at the point where the ground-level survey confirmed the original beacon's substrate coordinates, with a simple inscription: the date of the beacon's embedding, the date of its decoding, and the date of the morning I am describing. The third date had been added 3 months before, when the xenological division confirmed the engagement window with enough precision to establish the calendar. I had walked past that marker most working days for 26 years, and stopped at it most of those days to read the third date, which had always been a date in the future, and to think about what it meant that someone had known to put it there. That morning I stopped at it again. The third date was now today. It had been the future for 26 years of my morning walk, and now it was today. And the sky above the Caliph Shore district was clear, and the market was running, and the transit lane was on schedule, which was exactly what 12,000 years of preparation had been working toward. I stood at the marker for a few minutes, and I thought about the people who had made the third date possible. Not just the Thresh Contingency Authority and their 12,000 years of engineering work, but the educators who had decided that this history belonged in every school, in every district, Not just the technical records, but the meaning of it. The civic planners who had built the notification protocols and the briefing procedures so that when the morning came, the people in the district knew what was happening and what it meant, and could trust the preparation enough to go about their lives. The transit authority operators who had maintained normal schedules under a sky full of 4,000 vessels, because that was the instruction, and because the instruction was right. All of them part of the same long chain. All of them contributing to the same prepared answer that I had stood at my window and watched work. The district looked the way the Calith Shore district always looks. Old and new at once. The layers visible if you know where to look. The depth of accumulated history below the street level. The memorial marker at street level. The towers above it. The platforms, visible as bright fixed points in the clear autumn sky above the towers. The life of a place that has known what it is and what it has to do for a very long time, and has done it, and will keep doing it, and doesn't need the drama of a morning's event to remind it of that. I had lunch with my granddaughter at her school cafeteria, at a table by the window with a view of the northern shelf and the water beyond it. She had printed a summary of the Accord's preliminary notification from the monitoring feed and had questions prepared, which is exactly the kind of person she is. She asked me about the TSORA redirect, whether it was strange to watch 900 vessels simply change course like that, whether they seemed to know they were being redirected. I told her that as far as I could tell, they did not know in any sense I could observe. They redirected the way a current redirects, all at once, the whole thing moving together. She asked me if I thought the redirected vessels would come back again someday. I said probably not in our lifetimes, and that the Xenological Division would be working on that question, and that the answer to it was something for the Thresh Contingency Authority's current generation to prepare for the way the previous generations had prepared for what happened this morning. She nodded at that, writing something in her notebook. She asked me what it felt like. I thought about it for a moment. I told her about the grief, which surprised her. She had expected me to say triumph or relief, or something in that register. I explained what I meant: not grief for us, not grief for the city or the district, or anything the Thresh might have done, but grief for what they were, and for the particular quality of a thing that crosses 44,000 years of space, following an instinct that cannot update itself, cannot receive new information, cannot know that the world at the end of the path has changed. Grief for the distance and the certainty, and the arrival at the wrong answer after all of that. She thought about that for a moment, and then she said, "But if they had made it, if the answer hadn't worked," she stopped. Then she said, "A lot of people would have been hurt." "Yes," I said. "A great many people. Which is why 12,000 years of people worked to make sure the answer would work." She looked at her notebook. Then she looked up at me. She said, "I want to work on the next thing, the next contingency. Whatever the Thresh Contingency Authority is going to work on now that this is done." I said, "Good." I said, "That is the whole point. The chain continues. Someone starts the next letter, and someone else carries it forward, and eventually, someone who has not yet been born delivers it. That is what 12,000 years of preparation looks like when it is working correctly." She nodded and went back to her notes. And I looked out the window at the clear autumn sky above the northern shelf. And I thought, yes, this is the whole of it. The morning in the window, and the marker in the pavement, and the granddaughter with the notebook asking the right questions. The chain continues. It has always continued. It will continue. The readiness that produced that morning was not produced by a government. In the end, it was produced by people who decided, generation after generation, that the work was worth doing and the memory was worth keeping. My grandmother's grandmother taught her. I taught my students. My granddaughter will teach whoever comes after her. The Pulse had called the Thresh home for 44,000 years. Earth had spent 12,000 of them building an answer. Not because it was required to, not because some authority mandated it, because the people who decoded the signal understood what was coming and decided, in the specific, unglamorous way of people who are very good at their work and very clear about their responsibilities. That the people who would be standing at windows on that morning deserved to have an answer already waiting when they looked up at the sky. The answer was ready when they arrived. The people who built it are gone. The memory that produced it is not gone, and will not be gone. It is in the district, in the marker at the base of the shelf, in the curriculum taught in every school in Calith Shore, in the faces of 14-year-olds asking the right questions over lunch in a school cafeteria on a clear autumn day. That is the whole of what I saw from my window that morning, and the whole of what I know how to say about it, and the whole of what I believe needs to be said. The rest belongs to the people who come after.